So yes, thank you, Monique, for your time, and I will hand over to you.
Wonderful. I'm just going to share my screen and then we will get started and do that from the beginning. 2 seconds. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to try cover quite a bit, so bear with me. It's going to be a whistle-stop tour. So I'm Monique. I'm a research fellow at the University of Stirling, and I do a lot around the meta side of autism science, in particular how things like biases and things like neuronormativity shape autism science. So this talk comes with a really very big trigger warning because I cover a lot of things, including the dehumanization of autistic people in autism science. So everyone's got that warning there. I think that's pretty important. It's undoubtedly like a very important topic, but if it's something that's going to really affect your mental health, please God be willing to step away. It shouldn't be the be all and end all. Bit about me. I'm an autism researcher. This is kind of part of a project, or spawned at the beginning of a project for the Leverhulme Fellowship. I did my PhD and my MSc in psychology at the University of Surrey, and before that I did social care practice at a university in Ireland. And at that point, I worked with autistic people and their autistic children, young people and their families in community settings.
Sorry, Monique, can I just interrupt you for a second? I think your PowerPoint is in presenter view.
So
we're seeing all of the business on the outside.
Oh, give me 2 seconds.
No worries.
This always does it, and I think it's because I've got 2 screens.
That'll be it.
Okay, wait. I'm gonna unplug the other screen, and then there we go. Is that better?
Now we're perfect. Got it.
Wonderful.
There's a okay, it stopped. Okay, sorry for a sec. There was a weird noise, but it stopped.
Wonderful. So, briefly, why I always introduce myself like this at seminars, because people often roll up to give talks and they just throw information at you and they present themselves as if they're coming from a position of nowhere. And then they have this idea that they have the view from nowhere, that they aren't influenced by things like their background. They treat their stance as objective, or as if knowledge speaks for itself. They fail to acknowledge that they themselves are the sum of their experiences in their position in society. So anything that they are saying is undoubtedly influenced by that. Wait, that's going in the wrong direction. Oh, that's my bad. I went the wrong way. Anyway, and they pass on knowledge as if knowledge is separate from who they are, and I don't want to do that. This talk is very much partly about who I am and how I've ended up where I am, and I don't think that is that you're able to separate those things. So my talk is an amalgamation of a lifetime of being autistic and also ADHD. It comes from doing an undergraduate in social care practice and the work that I did with community settings and autistic people and their families. It comes from doing an MSc and a PhD with a focus on things like poor mental health and minority stress and community connectedness, because that's where I really got my exposure to just how dehumanizing autism science can be. And it's also informed by my other identities, some of which confer additional minority stress, some of which don't. It comes from things like my gender, it comes from growing up working class, it comes from, I know that I've got a certain position in research that means that I get listened to more than others, including the fact that I'm white, whereas we really don't listen to Black academics and that sort of thing. So all of these things inform my stance, and I think it's good to really acknowledge that. So this seminar will focus on two things. One, the paper, which was an autoethnography on autism and autism knowledge production. And the other is, very briefly, a study that we've done looking at how autism researchers construct autistic people in autism research, but that will be a whistle-stop tour because we don't have all the time in the world. And then there should be a chance to ask questions as long as I move quick enough. And yeah, if you ask those at the end, it'll be a bit easier. So the field of autism research, as basically everyone here will know, is full of deeply contested issues. Even at a fundamental level, there is basically very little agreement about the ontology of autism, which is what autism is at a fundamental level. There's very little agreement about who can tell you about what autism is and what constitutes a reliable source, so the epistemology of autism, and who should be responsible for knowledge creation. And this is further reflected in the disconnect of like where autism research funding goes and where autistic people really want that funding to go. And this kind of comes down to a really distinct split in values. Talking about that idea of autism being contested, even down to the approach, is it medical, is it social? Some people take it from a medical model of disability, other people take it from a social model of disability. Autistic people tend to prefer identity-first language, that is saying autistic, whereas professionals and researchers tend to rely on person-first language, which is person with autism. And yet autistic people tend to have less stigmatizing and more accurate knowledge around autism, but they're not actually perceived to be reliable sources on autism knowledge. And this gets reflected in really disparate funding priorities, right? In general, autistic people tend to want autism research funding to go on things like the applied stuff, mental health, quality of life, support services, and so do families actually, whereas the majority of the autism research that is done tends to be on things like basic science, things like neuroscience, genetics, cures, cause, that sort of thing. And interestingly, it's actually very rare that we ask autistic people what they want. A meta-analysis on this that was done a little while ago showed that I think it was for every one autistic person who was asked what we wanted for research priorities, 9 neurotypical people were asked. So we very rarely get to direct that either. Why does examining these meta issues really matter? Well, because scientists and researchers hold immense power. That includes controlling the direction, allocation, and uses of astoundingly large amounts of funding research which gets spent on autism research. But also, researchers will create ideas of autistic people which will be reproduced in societal and cultural structures. At the end of the day, the idea that autistic people lack empathy came from research and gets reproduced in a lot of things like newspapers, TV programs, stereotypes, which means that we really have an ability to control how autistic people are perceived. Then, as well as that, we can create ideas of autistic people which may strengthen or limit the idea of autistic epistemic authority. So, for example, the idea that autistic people lack theory of mind has been used to argue that autistic people can't tell you what it means to be autistic, that we can't know ourselves enough. And that idea has meant that people take less seriously first-hand accounts or research which involves autistic people more deeply. So really our lives, physically and socially, are quite literally in the hands of researchers and how they decide to construct us. If autism is constructed as a disease to be eradicated, well, then lots of research funding will go to that, and we lurch ever closer to that moment. In the autoethnography, one of the things that I really do is I question my relationship to myself. So where and what am I okay doing or being? How have my experiences led me here? What are my values? Because I haven't had the smoothest relationship with autism research as a whole. There's a lot out there that's dehumanizing and objectifying, and every now and again I stop and ask myself, you know, am I contributing to something that has been actively dehumanizing me? You know, what is my role? What is my responsibility? How much of myself should I give to this? Then I also question my relationship to my community. What can I or should I be doing to address the systemic issues that face autistic people like me in my community? But also, how can I do this equitably and sustainably, both for me so that I don't burn out being exposed to all of this, but also for my community when I involve autistic people who aren't in research with research. What can I do and what am I doing for them? Because if I expose them to these same things, they can get exposed to things like dehumanization themselves. And then lastly, I question my relationship to the literature. How am I and those like me constructed? What role do I play in this now that I am a researcher? Where does it spill into my life, and how do I both emerge from it and separate it? Some of the things that I got exposed to as an undergraduate, a master's student, and while doing my PhD was so disturbing. And I'll go over some of it, but essentially, when you're autistic and you read all of these things, you start thinking, is that me? Is that, you know, how I want to be portrayed? How do I separate how that scientist is talking about me and who I am as a person? And I think that this whole relationship and all of these relationships are summed up by Escher's hands, because I am a researcher generating knowledge about autism while being autistic, and that will come to constitute other autistic people. And it can be really hard to unpick everything, including my complicated feelings towards, you know, autism researchers who do publish very dehumanizing things. And the other problem is that it's kind of like Schrodinger's autistic, in that you're either seen as too autistic to be able to tell anyone what it means to be autistic, so then a neurotypical will step in and say, let me talk, or you're not autistic enough, therefore your testimony doesn't matter, right? And you see this all the time. Every time like someone talks about being autistic, there'll be at least one person who steps in and says, but you can't talk for my insert here, they're too low functioning. So we aren't really seen as reliable sources either to our own experiences or other autistic people's experiences, and we're simultaneously too autistic to tell people what it means to be autistic, and not autistic enough to be reflective of autism. So either way, there's always a neurotypical researcher or person who's willing to step in and talk over you. Some formative experiences that I had in my career that really changed the course of my career. First, I learned about autism through a module called Abnormal Psychology. Second, I was made to memorize the triad of impairments in the Salian experiments, and you know, this idea that autistic people fail to infer the thoughts, actions, or motivations of others. I had person-first language drilled into my brain, including the idea that this is to remind people that people with autism are human too. And I was like, do people need that reminder? Like, if I say I'm autistic, do you automatically go, boom, you're not human? Because that seems like a you problem rather than a me problem. But I had to be the one to, like, you know, really get this drilled into me. Then I also encountered a book which argued, on the basis of theory of mind, that autistic people were incapable of community. And I was horrified, because I'd learn all this stuff and then I'd go away and be involved in this vibrant community of autistic people who were working really hard to meet each other's needs. only to be told that no, absolutely not. Communities of disabled people exist, autistic people exist, but communities of autistic people are impossible because theory of mind. And I was like, that does not sound like sound logic, especially when you've got something contrary in terms of evidence right there. I also encountered a paper which argued that autistic people were less domesticated than non-autistic people. And actually, when I called this paper out as being dehumanizing, I also got a really threatening message where they were like, that's slander. And I was like, absolutely not, because you literally say at a morphological level, behavioral and psychological level, autistic people are less domesticated. That's your argument. But imagine reading this about yourself. It's not pleasant. And also, the last thing that really changed the direction of my career was encountering a paper which found that early mortality of autistic people, including through an extremely high rate of suicide. And that's what made me start studying minority stress, because everyone was like, maybe it's the symptoms of autism. And I was like, have you seen the immense pressure that autistic people live under? We're plagued by problems in social living, including discrimination, and everyone's willing to individualize this, but you can't remove it from the social context. But it seemed like research, left, right, and center, was just really willing to blame autistic people for their own outcomes. And that's the thing. I discovered the vast dehumanization of the field. Autistic people are denied identity, community, often treated as without boundaries, as foilable. We very rarely even measure harm when it comes to intervention studies. We don't consider that autistic people might be getting hurt, and are treated as lacking in secondary emotions, which are the more complex emotions. We're treated almost as being simultaneously aggressive, lacking in empathy. The paper which argued that autistic people were less domesticated, one of the things that they argued was that autistic people are like quick to aggression and irritable. And I'm like, genuinely, you would be too, Chad, if you experienced chronic marginalization and experienced poor mental health at such a high rate. Yeah, you're going to be pretty pissed, right? But again, all of it came down to individualizing and blaming autistic people. And autistic people are treated as irrational just by virtue of our experiences being different. Rather than understanding things as differences, they immediately become deficit. Autistic people like routines, that's irrational. Autistic people, even in certain experiments, might behave more consistently between private and public settings. That's irrational. And you're like, actually, it's just consistency. And like I said earlier, I'd hazard a bet that the dehumanization and objectification of autistic people is why we don't measure harm in intervention studies, because I don't think we necessarily treat autistic people as if they can be harmed or have boundaries which can be crossed. Anyway, participatory research might provide a disruption for this. You see autistic people getting involved in research in many levels, whether lay or professionally, and often autistic people, to use Dinah Murray's words, can be productive irritants and usually flip research processes on their head. I like to think of autistic people as wrench throwers who often, push research, stop it in its tracks and basically change its direction, but often end up creating in return a much more humanizing science. Which brings me to this study where, as part of my ESRC and Leverhulme, I wanted to understand these processes more. I'm only just started the Leverhulme. I want to say it was like really recent, but it's now 6 months ago almost. So it's terrifying. And I'll just present like a snapshot of this mixed method research, because following on from the autoethnography, I really wanted to understand what role autistic people being involved in science actually plays for how researchers construct autistic people. And also to examine these empirically, this dehumanization. And one of the things that we wanted to see was whether including autistic people throughout research processes might reduce the odds of the frequency of stigmatizing and dehumanizing narratives that researchers hold. And we did this through a mixed method study. You can see there the questions, it was like open-ended questions because we wanted to be able to see how stigma or cues of ableism might form in people's narratives. Plus, you can't give researchers a social stigma scale because they're going to pick up on that really quickly and demand characteristics. So we wanted to do it based on what people were writing. We also asked about how participatory their research was based on Einstein's ladder of participation, and then demographic information. We had to do targeted sampling because if I just put it up on Twitter, the circles that I run in tend to be, I would argue, less dehumanizing. So we had to email essentially a whole bunch of people who had attended INSAR in previous years to be like, please take our study. Uptake was low, unsurprisingly. That was our little ad. The analysis plan, the quantitative analysis, we did content analysis to have a look at whether people ascribe to medical or social narratives about autism, whether or not there were the presence of stigmatizing and dehumanizing cues in their narratives about autistic people. And then we wanted to use binary logistic regression, which I'll explain when I come to that, to have a look at whether or not involving autistic people more highly predicts a lower odd of stigmatizing cues, even when controlling for other contact with autistic people and research length and career, as well as a qualitative part of the study, which was a more ground-up thematic analysis, which I'll briefly touch on. So separately, Ailey Cage and I coded the open field questions and categorized people's narratives as either medical, social, or a third category came out, which was neutral embodiment, which was very much people who conceptualized autism as being like a neutral difference, but still very embodied, rather than about a social perspective. And also for cues of stigma and dehumanization. And we had a look at what predicted these while controlling for length of career and either familial or non-familial connections to autistic people. And this is what we find, and I'm going to very briefly go through it, which is that taking a social model approach or a neutral embodiment model predicts a significantly lower odds of having stigmatizing or dehumanizing cues in your narratives about autistic people, which I think no one will be surprised by. What's really interesting is that the degree of participatory research, so the more you involve autistic people in your research, predicts a significantly lower odds of the presence of stigmatizing and dehumanizing cues as well. So involving autistic people does, it seem, relate to being less likely to dehumanize and stigmatize autistic people, which I don't think anyone's surprised by. And this is beyond any effects of familial connections to autistic people or non-familial connections. In terms of qualitative findings, the good life is important, and here's why. Because the narratives which tended towards disorder and disease tend to place autism as individualized exclusively within an individual, yet manage to make the individual almost amorphous. It was referring to autism and not an autistic person. And for these people, suffering and impairment almost exclusively existed within autism, and it almost radiated out to affect the lives of the people around the autistic people, right? It disrupted families and societies and communities. So for example, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by a wide array of social communicational deficits, repetitive and restrictive behaviors, accompanied by a series of comorbid conditions that may severely impair the life of the affected subject, as well as that of his or her relatives. Pretty grim. But you can see it's autism and not an autistic person. It's very medical model. It's the autism that impairs the life of the autistic person, and it also impairs that of their family. And this is the thing, the locus of suffering and impairment was drastically different when it came to narratives which tended towards disability, neurodiversity, or autistic people as a neurominority. People who took a more social or embodied approach stressed the humanness of autistic people, placed autism inside an individual as genetic identity status, but placed the impairment, the suffering, and disablement primarily outside of the body or the person and into society, environment, and culture. So, for example, it is the society we live in, the lack of support available, and the ableist and heavily gendered expectations that exist which affect autistic people on a daily basis and lead to autism being described so negatively, even by other researchers. So there it is, autistic people, autism is a part of the autistic person, but it's the society which impairs people. And why does this matter? Well, partly because quality of life is going to come up, and it's a fluffy concept until you get to the nitty-gritty. Research which tackles autism, that amorphous disorder inside a person, inherent suffering and impairment which radiates outwards, well, that people tend to focus on that being the inherent barrier. And in that case, quality of life is to remove autism. So autism research should understand the genetics of autism-associated neurodevelopment. This may ultimately lead to screening, genetic counseling of parents, and potentially prevention, researching the collateral benefits of treatment for individuals with autism and their families and other relevant persons. Everyone wanted to improve quality of life for autistic people. Some people think that that means prevention. And subtyping was a part of this. So for the group of people who thought to increase quality of life, you need to remove autism from the person, researchers really focused on subtyping being the way forward. So this includes, for understanding subtypes of autism, models to understand the impact of these mutations, patient characterization, and drug trials. And I think that actually the move towards subtyping is where people put the heterogeneity of autistic people down to autism rather than the other identities we fall, and it's probably part of the dehumanization, which is what I just say there. Compare this to people who place the impairment within society, right? They think that quality of life in research is by tackling society. The injustices prevalent in society are where research can make a difference. Therefore, we should seek to involve autistic people in planning and carrying out autism research. To impact quality of life, research should consider interventions addressing socially valid outcomes for autistic individuals, as well as societal attitudes and acceptance and systems of support. At a high level, all of these researchers talked about things like quality of life. Then when you break it into the nitty-gritty, they're really talking about very different things. And this gets to eugenics and social value and actually why all of this matters. Well, where we focus today determines tomorrow, right? And this is about the eugenics or the genetic prevention of autistic people. So one researcher says, if the cause of autism was known, I fervently believe that this would be a terrible thing. Eugenics and social engineering, consciously and subconsciously, would take place, I believe, to prevent autistic people from being born, or at the very least ensure that they were born with non-autistic traits. And here's the thing, this wasn't actually unrealistic, given that other researchers who took part in the study had this goal. So someone says, autism research should pursue multiple goals, understanding the genetics of autism-associated neurodevelopment, This may lead to screening, genetic counselling of parents, and potentially prevention. Someone else says, I think the main goal should be to understand what causes autism and also what impacts the trajectory of autism for individuals over their life. By understanding the former, we may be able to intervene for parents before they have a child. And yet, when autistic people talk about these sorts of fears and concerns on Twitter, they get painted as anti-science. And part of this is the denial of subjectivity, identity, and epistemic authority. This is how it links in. Whenever even researchers acknowledge this when they're taking part, constructions of impairment or disablement that are out of the body, subscription to neurodiversity or identity, gets painted as irrational, under-evidenced, anti-science, or rose-tinted, and you'll suddenly see why subtyping matters. So a researcher says, some persons also claim autism as a descriptor of a social, political, community identity and make further claims about uniquely autistic styles of interaction or communication. As yet, there has been little research that would support or refute those claims. And the thing is, some of those things, like autism as identity, people have been talking about these things in like biographies and online for 30 years. There is actually a lot of evidence. We just don't consider that evidence to necessarily be applicable or trustworthy. And some refer to autism as a condition or neurodiversity. I think that really depends on where along the spectrum, which include multiple dimensions, one might be. Someone else says, scientifically, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that has deficits in social communication and interaction and social imagination. Alternatively, autism can be seen as a difference in thinking. But that's alternatively, that's not scientific. Scientifically, autism is a disorder. And this follows the same pattern that you see online, where people who do subscribe to neurodiversity must be the easy kind of autistics. And dehumanization, which Haslam defines as denial of full humanness, infantilization, being compared to non-human animals treated as lacking in rationality or refinement, cultural inability, passivity, fungibility, or machine-like comparisons. The thing about dehumanization is that the focus is on removing autism and not autistic people, even though these are one and the same. So people kept saying, you know, eradicate autism, remove autism. But autistic people in this process are treated as passive and fungible. This is something that happens to them or should happen to them, and we're not treated as having agency in that. But further, they're seen as these benefits, because if you think that suffering radiates outwards into things like communities, well then you also focus on the benefits of removing autism. And researchers relied on instrumentality when making these decisions. So instrumentality, objectification is about instrumentality, denial of autonomy, inertness, spoilability, ownership, denial of subjectivity or fungibility. Autistic people's value to society are described in relation to what we can do. And this same pattern spilled over into the way researchers talked about autistic people and autism. Whenever someone mentioned any benefits, it was in regards to professions and the creation of productivity, right? So it was certain skills. But someone even went a step further. So someone says, without often comorbid intellectual disability and dependent upon the severity of their autism, they are interesting, often charming, and valuable members of the community. And suddenly you see, by splitting autism into subtypes, we can group them into the kinds that are useful for society and the kinds that are not. And we hinge that on whether or not autistic people can create and live independently. And suddenly we have an onus for removing the autistic people that we don't like from essentially society. And the way that people do this is by dehumanizing autistic people to such a degree that they're like, it's okay for me to talk about removing you from society because really you're a bit of a burden. And here's the thing about the semantics and ableism. It's about palatability. By dehumanizing us, researchers can feel better about their goals. There's a semantic difference which affects the palatability of statements. I want to prevent or eradicate autism. Does not sound as bad as I want to prevent or eradicate autistic people. And it's almost like a nullification. If we just talk about autism, we're not talking about harming people, even though the goals directly harm autistic people. But the thing about autism is it is only ever people. There is no amorphous autism. There is literally just autistic people. And whenever researchers really talked about things like eugenics, they did lean back really heavily onto the idea of only talking about autism instead of talking about autistic people. And I think it's because that sounds a lot more palatable and a lot less ableist, even though they are one and the same. So what then for the future? Well, actually, I think it's complex. Autistic people, these are two sides of the same coin, and autistic people are caretakers to a really terrible legacy in autism research. So on one hand, it's really good to challenge neurotypical, normative, and poor science about autistic people. And it's good to write our own studies, including in science. It's good to be a part of science because you get a chance to turn things up on their head. We saw that the more autistic people were involved, the less they were dehumanized by autistic researchers or by autism researchers. But here's the other side of that, right? And it can be, we can't tell the direction of that effect, by the way. So it could be that the less you dehumanize autistic people, the more willing you are to work with them in your research. Simultaneously, it could be the more you work with autistic people, the less willing you are to dehumanize them. Personally, I think when we do more research on this, we'll discover that it's reciprocal. It's both of those things, rather than one or the other. The more you work with autistic people, the less willing you are to dehumanize them, but also you need to be willing to do that in the first place. And if you dehumanize autistic people, you're probably going to be reluctant to work with them. But all of this isn't without cost. The other part of this autoethnography was about anger, entanglement, and burnout. The brutal truth is that when you're autistic and you get involved in autism research, you also get dehumanized. You get told that you're biased. You aren't necessarily treated the same. And the other side of Escher's hands, whether you consider those to be pencils or pens, is that you're also using a finite resource, which is time and energy, and you spend a lot of your life trying to combat things like dehumanization. You try to do things like push for better autism science, and you often get things like hate mail or angry people on Twitter, and you get exposed to so much ableism that you otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. So you've got to be careful not to essentially run out of yourself enough that you can't keep doing these things, which means we have to be able to have a conversation about what it means to produce autism research sustainably for autistic people, including how we protect autistic people when they are involved, how we make productive, good, ethical autism science in partnership. So that was a really quick run through of a lot of work. I've got to say thank you to my funders, who are the only reason that I can do this work, because I've got to feed myself and keep a roof over my head. And that's the Leverhulme Trust, who's funding my current project, UKRI and SGSS, who funded my fellowship last year, which is when I started this research, and then obviously the University of Stirling. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Monique. we've had a very active chat coming, particularly in the second half of your talk. I'll give you a couple of minutes to collect yourself. And I'll just scroll through to one of the questions that came through. So this is a question from Callie. Have you heard of the RDOC, which is the Research Domain Criteria Initiative that the US NIH is working on? And how do you think it might affect views on autism?
If this is what I think it is, then yes, but it potentially isn't. And I think it's the Spectrum 10K partnered with them, but I could be wrong. But it's massive. Please, someone tell me if I'm wrong. Genetic study into autism? No.
Callie, feel free to pop in the chat or turn your microphone on if you like as well.
Hi, this is Callie. I'm trying to pull up the website right now, but it's the RDoC is basically a different way of thinking about research. It's a new framework that takes all these different domains and then works in the lifespan and the development along with it. So it's different from the DSM that's been developed already.
In which case, then that is something that I can safely say I do not know enough about to really comment on. I'd want to go have a look rather than make best guesses.
Absolutely, thank you.
We've got another question from Alex. Monique, I haven't heard you describe your work as autocritical disability studies. Is that term not used in your field? I've seen it used in literary, cultural, and social science areas of critical disability studies.
I have never heard that term before, so that probably answers that pretty well. But you also have to remember that psychology doesn't tend to be this sounds really bad, but a critical field in and of itself. It's also a very broken up field. So there are things like critical psychology, but even that's, I think, wildly different to the kind of critical approaches that things like social sciences, cultural studies, even disability studies really takes, and it's not something that would be widespread in psychology.
I didn't raise it at all to poke a hole in your knowledge or anything, Monique. I promise. It was more that I thought there's a whole load of people that you can be new friends with here that I know, and I'd love to, put you in touch with them and that, because they'd love what you're doing. It's that autocritical reflection on yourself as an autistic person doing the research.
Absolutely.
We're out here, and there's a whole new gang of friends to kind of back you up if you don't get that much backup in your field on critical work.
Yes, please. That would be really, really great. And I'm always happy for new friends who do work around this. I know that with another colleague of mine, we've been talking about for some time now, writing something about the role of autistic researchers in creating really good trauma-informed ways of conducting qualitative research with other autistic people. So that is absolutely yes. I'm please introduce me.
That was one of the things that really struck me reading your paper was it was like a penny dropping moment that we have so much critical reflexivity with qualitative research, but quantitative, it isn't there, and there is that assumption of objectivity, which isn't true.
That's the thing. I think psychologists, well, technically, I think all quantitative researchers, scientists as a whole, actually should be getting better training than we do into things like ethical issues and into things around philosophy of science, because you kind of get told these nice things that are quite easy to believe in until you start really looking at them. So for example, you get told this idea of experimental work being objective, being a view from nowhere, because you get this idea that numbers are trustworthy. but the funny thing is, no one fully like endorses that. If numbers were trustworthy, we wouldn't have an issue with reproducible science right now. We wouldn't need to rely on individual action to fix that problem, like, for example, making data sets available. But even this focus on reproducible science focuses only on such a small part of science. So it focuses on make your code available, make your data available, make sure that someone else can reproduce your findings statistically. But no one's actually talking about the framing of things and how bias can change that. Or, and this is the really important part, the interpretation phase. People consider data as if it kind of talks for itself, and it really doesn't. We've got to basically make decisions around what we think data is kind of doing. So there's first the decision process around, do we include outliers? Do we not include outliers? What data have we removed? What data have we not removed? Then there are the decisions. You see this all the time, this interpretation bias, where even when autistic people outperform non-autistic people, it gets interpreted as a deficit, even when the trait is favorable. So you see this in morality studies, where autistic people are deemed to be lacking in impression management when they behave more favorably. And that's clearly something going wrong with the interpretation phase of science. So focusing on like data and processes around data alone aren't going to fix that, because it's a lot more subtle. So yes, but I could talk about that all day, because it is.
A lot of my my early training in psychology was around psychometrics. So I have like quite a strong foundation in psychometrician attitudes and behaviors, and there's so much to talk about there in terms of the history of psychology being deeply problematic. But the thing that really struck me in that is a lot of people will look at, a CSV file and they'll see a number as a data point and disregard where it came from. The individual that you had in the testing room and all the individuation that they demonstrated, but also the measurement tool can be utterly and completely and fundamentally flawed, which then undermines everything. So I've always tried to champion that, despite it not being the sexiest area of psychology, it should be the first thing that our first year students learn is measurement, because it underpins everything.
I think one of the great examples of that is the fact that the intelligence tests that we use with in research came from a very problematic and racist history that a lot of people don't know about. And it turns out putting people on bell curves was one of our first mistakes as a field. And the second is that it underestimates intelligence in autistic people, which the reason that I focus on this, even though I don't believe that intelligence testing is doing what people think it's doing, is because intelligence and ability to live independently seem to be the two axes where we start considering autistic people to either have or lack personhood and worth. Where autistic people are considered to be highly intelligent or highly independent, those are the autistic people we say that we can afford, right? But even some people go further, where they're like, oh, unless they make other people uncomfortable, then we can't. And I'm like, how can you talk like this and not see the dehumanization? But we're also setting autistic people up to fail in this regard when we're creating psychometrics which underestimate their ability in comparison with non-autistic people. But another layer to that, undoubtedly, and that's already a really problematic sandwich, is the fact that it hinges on things where there are common differences, including things like language, which we already have such a value-based judgment on. So it excludes autistic people who use other methods to communicate, which everyone or a lot of people already focus on as being so problematic. Genuinely non-speaking autistic people do not have the same experience necessarily in terms of equality as speaking autistic people. And that's not to say that, you know, it's autistic people who speak have it like easy. That's not the case at all. We know that from things like suicide statistics. But instead, when we're creating all of these tests that hinge on these specific capabilities, we're setting autistic people up to fail from the beginning, and then we're using that failure as a justification for why autistic people shouldn't exist. There's no real way to win there, is there? So I'm really passionate about that.
Yeah. There's one question from Gabby in the chat, and then I will actually turn the recording off. And if anybody has any questions that they don't want to be recorded, feel free to pop it in the chat, or you can send it to me privately if you like, as well. So Gabby is asking, you talk about participatory research. How can non-academic autistics contribute in a concrete way, and what channels are there to contribute?
So there's a couple of things here. One, I want to make clear that autistic people who have the ability to talk about their experiences openly or in some public way already do contribute, because I really think that our stories are powerful, and being able to tell our own stories in the ways that we want to, whether that's words, non-spoken communication, whatever, the more of a critical mass behind our stories, the harder it will become to dehumanize us. And I fundamentally believe that. If you want to get involved with research, there are a couple of things. One, I would advise that you can get involved there are research groups up and down the country, but I would also urge caution and getting to know a research group, well, having a look at their work. And the reason that I say this is more and more autism research groups and cohorts are looking to involve autistic people more, but some of it is more genuine than others. And what I mean by that is that the ability to be tokenized is rampant. Even though I've got all of this expertise for multiple different domains, I have found myself being tokenized. And I should have, I would say, more of an ability to be able to unpick where that's going to happen, and I don't yet. But finding a research group and saying you want to be involved is absolutely a route to go. Just make sure you look at a person's publications, make sure you look at how they interact with autistic people on Twitter, because if they've put something out there that's really problematic and they just don't respond to any autistic people's feedback, that's not a research group you want to be involved in, because it means that they lack humility, the ability to learn and change their stance. And it also means that there's a good chance that you will be giving feedback and your time and energy into what is essentially a black hole. It's going to go nowhere. And make sure that you value yourself enough to make sure that you are working with people where you will be appreciated and understood and heard. Don't give yourself over to people who will only see you as a token. I don't know if that is a good answer to the question, if you wanted something that was more practical, but yeah.
There's some suggestions happening in the chat as well, and if anybody has any concrete suggestions that they'd like me to send out along with the recording link, I'm happy to do that as well. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.